Signals gone, Vanlaro muttered under his breath as he tapped furiously at the console in front of him. His hands were steady, despite the rising tension in his chest. The Vernath, a sleek scout ship, drifted silently in the dark reaches of Wriglin space, cloaked from detection. Ven's mission was simple: gather intel on the Wriglin mining colonies, their operations, and if possible, any weaknesses in their military presence. But something felt off. His sensors buzzed faintly, signaling irregularities in the usual patrols. He had to act fast. There was no time to waste. His fingers danced across the keys, inputting the last transmission of data to Earth. His mission complete. The images of Wriglin fleet movements, strategic installations hidden beneath layers of defenses, the cracks in their empire. He had it all. This was more than just a scouting report. It was proof. Proof that the Wriglins, despite their overwhelming military force, had a critical vulnerability they never saw coming. Just as he finished the final encryption of the transmission, his console blared with a warning. Van's heart skipped a beat. "They're here." Without hesitation, his hand flew to the controls, initiating evasive maneuvers. But it was already too late. A blinding flash, not a warning, not a signal, just the cold shock of a plasma torpedo hitting the starboard side. The ship shuddered violently, sending him hurtling forward, his head slamming into the cold steel console. Blood dripped from his temple as his vision blurred, but he fought to stay conscious. His last thought before everything went dark: "I've sent it. They'll know." On the Verdak Prime, Drake Voss, Wriglin military commander, and the embodiment of the Empire's dominance, leaned over his command deck. The sleek, imposing ship hummed with activity as his crew moved like clockwork, executing their orders with precision. But even he, the most battle-hardened of Wriglin tacticians, could feel the unease in the air. Something was off. He gripped the armrests of his command chair as his eyes flicked across the glowing heads-up display. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of his tactical officer. "Commander, we've lost contact with the scout ship, Vernath," the officer reported, his voice steady, but laced with concern. Voss didn't flinch. "It's just a glitch. Continue with the scan." The officer hesitated. "Sir, the ship's last transmission, it was encrypted with unusual patterns. We can't decode it." "Then break the encryption," Voss growled, his patience thinning. "They're just another fleeting problem. We've faced worse." He straightened, projecting confidence. The technician nodded, but as the seconds ticked by, unease began to creep into the room. The laser plasma displays in front of Voss flickered again, this time showing a new readout, something different. He narrowed his eyes as a series of coordinates began to appear, followed by a black screen that seemed to devour the data at an alarming rate. "What's happening?" Voss barked. The technician's hands flew over the console. "I don't know, sir. Fleet 22 has disappeared. The entire division, just gone." Voss's pulse quickened. He stood abruptly, his hands slamming against the edge of the console. "Impossible. You're reading it wrong." But the flickering screens told him otherwise. The images now on every display were of nothing. No wreckage, no debris, nothing. Meanwhile, Marnik Rot, the mastermind behind the United Earth Coalition's covert operations, stood in the dimly lit command center, his gaze fixed on the laser plasma display. The data from Vanlaro had come in just moments before his final transmission was lost. Despite the danger, Marnik felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Laro's sacrifice wasn't in vain. His intel revealed the critical weakness. The Wriglins had grown complacent, unable to see the storm brewing within their own sector. He activated the quantum gravitic disruptors, a near-sentient AI-powered weapon system, capable of manipulating gravity at a quantum level. Its purpose: to destabilize the very fabric of space around the Wriglin fleets, and send them spiraling into nothingness, drawn into artificial singularities, created by gravity mines. It wasn't about brute force. This was a war of intellect, of quiet precision. Every move, every piece of technology, had been designed for one purpose: to obliterate the Wriglin Empire without them ever knowing what hit them. As Marnik entered the coordinates into the system, he knew he was about to break the illusion of Wriglin invulnerability. The first mine was deployed, drifting into the vast nothingness of space, ready to pull the first Wriglin fleet into the abyss. His fingers hovered over the console, and as the first gravity mine activated, a quiet whir filled the room. The mine was designed to be undetectable by Wriglin sensors. It was a simple device, and yet it was more devastating than any ship or weapon the Wriglins had ever built. Back on the Verdak Prime, Voss's face turned pale as another report came in. "Sir, Fleet 19. The voice from the officer quivered, the impact of the news hitting them all at once. Drake Voss shook his head in disbelief, his fists clenched. "What's happening to them?" he asked, his voice almost inaudible. The officer's gaze flicked nervously between the screen. "I can't explain it, sir. It's like they just vanished." Suddenly the main display cracked, and Voss's heart skipped a beat as he saw what had been left behind. There was nothing, no debris, no wreckage, no warning, just a deep, empty void, where once his fleets had. Voss ran a hand through his hair. "Activate defensive grid. Lock down all communications. I want to know what's happening now." As the gravity mines continued to destabilize Wriglin forces, Marnik watched from his command center on Earth, the satisfaction building in his chest. He knew what was coming next. The complete destruction of an empire that had believed itself invincible. "Activate the system," Marnik had commanded, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The room around him hummed with the quiet intensity of operation. He stood before the console, his hands poised over the heads-up display, watching the final calculations run. Earth had already suffered under the Wriglins, but it was time for the tide to turn. This mission would not be like any before. This time, humanity would fight on its terms, intelligent, precise, and unseen. The final set of coordinates flashed across the display. It was time. The quantum gravitic disruptors had been activated. The technology, one of Earth's most closely guarded secrets, was now fully operational. A calculated weapon, not meant for open battle, but for subtle destruction. Instead of an overwhelming military assault, humanity would disrupt the very fabric of the Wriglin Empire's dominance. With every step, Marnik's mind replayed the final transmission from Ven Laro, now immortalized in his heart and mind, a constant reminder of what the Wriglins had taken from them. It wasn't just his mission, it was their mission. Ven had shown them the path. "System engaging," came the cold report from his tactical officer, breaking Marnik's moment of reflection. The officer's words were sharp, unwavering. "Coordinate the first mine release," Marnik ordered, his gaze fixed on the digital map that spread out before him like a chessboard of infinite space. Each mine, each gravity mine, would destabilize a Wriglin fleet, pulling them into the unknown, where not even their advanced ships could fight back. Earth had no intention of matching the Wriglins' firepower. They would simply erase it. The officers at the station worked quickly, their fingers flying over consoles, initiating commands and confirming the activation. The UEC was mobilized, not in the way the Wriglins might have expected, with fleets ready for combat, but in a much more calculated manner. Their weapon was strategy itself. No explosions, no missiles, just gravity, bending space and time in ways the Wriglins had never anticipated. As the quantum gravitic disruptors began their work, Marnik couldn't help but reflect on the psychological toll of this new kind of warfare. He thought about Ven Laro, who had died trying to send back the last piece of information, warning them of the vulnerability in the Wriglin Empire. A human scout. One life. And now, Laro's sacrifice would be the catalyst for their revolution, their rebirth. The first gravity mine was deployed, its trajectory flawless. There would be no warning for the Wriglins. The system was too advanced for them to even detect. The first sign they would receive of the impending collapse would be their fleets, drawn into nothingness, swallowed by black holes of their own making. Meanwhile, Drake Voss, aboard the Verdak Prime, stood before his personal console. The thick, artificial atmosphere inside the flagship felt heavier than usual today, almost oppressive. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. His fleet, the pride of the Wriglin Empire, was performing at peak capacity. Yet the data streams were starting to flicker with abnormalities. Fleets were vanishing, without a trace, without any trace of battle or debris. His eyes narrowed as he reviewed the reports, each one more perplexing than the last. "Commander," his officer's voice broke through the air. "Another fleet has disappeared, sir." Voss's hands clenched around the armrests of his chair. He was calm, too calm for what was happening. The confidence he had in his fleet's dominance had been unwavering, but now it was beginning to crack. "Explain," he ordered sharply. The officer's fingers flew over the console, issuing the commands to pull up the latest scans. Fleet 17 was absorbed, into something we can't identify. No signs of any collision. No signals. Just disappearance. Absorbed. What are you talking about? Voss demanded, his voice rising. We don't know, Commander. We've lost contact entirely. The officer's voice trailed off in confusion. Send reinforcements to that sector, Voss barked, though he wasn't convinced it would help. Deep down he felt the first stirrings of doubt. This wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't a mistake. This was something else. But what? His fleet, his empire, his entire sector gone. Back on Earth, Marnik paced, in the command center, the faint glow from the laser plasma displays illuminating his features. His mind raced as the data from the first wave of gravity mines continued to feed into the system. The UEC's plan was unfolding. The damage was silent, invisible. The Wriglins were helpless. Yet despite the victory, Marnik's mind couldn't escape the weight of Van Laro's loss. He turned sharply as the report came in from his chief operations officer. Commander, the first mine has deployed successfully. Wriglin fleet is missing. The signal is gone. A chill ran through Marnik's veins. It wasn't just a win. It was something else. Continue with the plan, he ordered, though the weight of his own words pressed heavily on him. Drake Voss slammed his fist against the console. The black hole on his screen continued to grow, consuming his ships one by one. The Verdak Prime was still moving, but at this rate, it was only a matter of time before his entire fleet would be drawn in. He stood there for a moment, staring into the void. How could this happen? How could he, a seasoned Wriglin commander, fall victim to something so subtle? Commander, we have a situation, came the officer's voice, strained with disbelief. Our entire fleet is Voss. Didn't let him finish. He grabbed the communication panel and hit a button. Signal the Imperial fleet. Call in reinforcements. I want every available unit on the line. The first phase of the quantum gravitic disruptor technology had been executed. Humanity had initiated its invisible war, and already, the Wriglin Empire was beginning to falter. Marnik wrote, observed the data, watching the first cracks appear in the enemy's formidable armor. This wasn't just an attack. It was the unraveling of an empire, the first steps of a war that would reshape the galaxy. Still, Marnik knew the war was far from over. The Wriglin Empire was proud, and they would retaliate, but that was part of the plan, wasn't it? Let them retaliate. Let them try to fight back. Humanity would be waiting. He turned to his officer. Prepare for the next phase, Marnik said, his voice cold, calculating. We've only just begun. Commander, we've got another missing fleet, the tactical officer said, her voice low but trembling slightly. Drake Voss didn't look up from the heads-up display in front of him. The glowing map of Wriglin space showed the fleet coordinates flickering as they should, but there was no sign of the ships. Another anomaly? Voss asked, still staring at the holographic grid, pretending not to care. His tone was controlled, the words slow, deliberate. Yes, Fleet 35, just vanished. The officer hesitated, as if unsure of the next words. No wreckage, no debris, just gone. Voss's hand tightened around the console. The words had begun to echo in his mind, over and over. The same words he had dismissed at first. Gone. Vanished. Absorbed. It didn't make sense. Wriglin technology was the pinnacle of military advancement. The Empire had never faced an enemy capable of this kind of evaporation. Check the systems again, Voss said, his voice low but insistent. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, the pulse of light that mapped his Empire's fleets, as they drifted across space, unaware of the invisible threat closing in on them. Running diagnostics now, sir, the officer replied, tapping on the controls. The beeping of the console seemed louder than it should have been, an odd, staccato rhythm. Voss could feel the tension building, thick like a storm in the air, and yet nothing was happening. Nothing, except the growing list of fleets that ceased to exist. They didn't even know what was happening to them. Not yet. Back on Earth, Marnik Roth stood with his back to the glass wall of his command center, his gaze fixed on the glowing data streams, displayed across laser plasma displays. He felt the weight of his decision, but it didn't cloud his mind. There was no room for doubt. There never had been. He had prepared for this moment for years, waiting, studying the Wriglin Empire's arrogance, their reliance on brute force. This was a subtle war, a war of silence, invisible to the enemy. First mine is successfully deployed, the officer beside him reported, his eyes flicking nervously from the heads-up display. Their entire military structure is already beginning to destabilize, sir. Good, Marnik muttered, but it was more to himself than anyone else. A feeling of calm satisfaction washed over him. This wasn't about winning, it was about rewriting history. Rewriting the arrogance of an empire that had never truly respected Earth. The Wriglins had thought them weak, scattered. Now Marnik wrote was erasing them, one fleet at a time, and no one would ever know how it happened. The first fleet is gone, sir, the officer continued, the words hanging heavy in the air, and they don't even know it yet. Marnik turned slightly to face the officer, his eyes cold, calculating. Prepare the second stage. Meanwhile, the Verdak Prime continued its steady path through space. Drake Voss remained at the helm, forcing himself to concentrate on the tactical map. Even though his mind was elsewhere, the feeling gnawed at him. This wasn't just a series of bad luck or equipment failure. The Empire's fleet was vanishing. But there was no explanation, no trace, as though someone was systematically erasing them. Sir, the officer said again, another fleet has just disappeared. Voss's breath caught in his chest. His gaze flickered to the display, where the coordinates of Fleet 19 should have been. There was nothing but empty space. Deploy reinforcements to that sector immediately, he snapped. This is no coincidence. They're being picked off one by one. This has to be deliberate. The officer hesitated, looking unsure. But Commander, no one is firing. No battle was detected. Voss turned slowly, locking eyes with the officer. Then it's not a battle, it's a slaughter. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing. But his features remained calm. It couldn't be true. It simply couldn't be. Wriglin ships couldn't disappear into thin air. It wasn't possible. On Earth, Marnik watched the next phase unfold. The quantum gravitic disruptors hummed with energy, their gravimetric field expanding silently across the galaxy. Earth wasn't striking at the Wriglins with violence. Earth was attacking with something more profound, something far beyond their comprehension. The gravity mines were already doing their work, sucking entire fleets into nothingness, into voids created by a force so quiet it could never be detected. Each mine, activated in silence, erased another piece of the Wriglins' empire. It was methodical. It was surgical. Back on the Verdak Prime, Voss clenched his fists. Send a message to Fleet 5. No, send it to all remaining fleets. Increase patrols. Check every corner of the sector. And if you find anything unusual, report it immediately. The panic was beginning to creep into his voice. Though he wouldn't let it show, he was Wriglin. He was untouchable. We can't keep losing fleets like this, the officer said, voice trembling. We're losing too much ground. What's happening to them, Commander? Voss didn't have an answer. There was no logic to it, no strategy, nothing but empty space, and the growing sensation that something was closing in on them, unseen and unstoppable. The first gravity mine had struck, and the Wriglins still had no idea what was happening. Drake Voss wasn't even sure yet if he could still stop it. The feeling of helplessness grew with every fleet that vanished, leaving behind nothing but eerie empty space, where once proud ships had drifted. In the heart of the Verdak Prime, Voss finally spoke. Activate the fleet defense grid. We need to know what's happening. This ends now. But deep down, Voss knew it was already too late. The Wriglins had been erased before they even realized they were under attack. Back on Earth, Marnik stood at the edge of the command center, watching the next phase unfold on the heads-up display. He saw the coordinates of the next fleet to vanish. His heart beat steadily as the confirmation came through. The Wriglins were gone again, and with every disappearance, the balance of power was tilting further away from the Wriglins. Marnik let out a slow breath. Prepare the final stage. Another one gone. The officer's voice faltered, barely above a whisper. Drake Voss stood motionless at the command console, the weight of the words settling around him like a stone sinking into the depths of his mind. A fleet, wiped out. Just like that. The display before him flickered again, the numbers of the fleet's coordinates vanishing into nothingness. Keep talking, don't stop, Voss snapped, his voice harsh, forcing himself to focus. I want every fleet tracked, now. The officer fumbled with the controls, trying to piece together the puzzle. Fleet 42 gone, Commander. We can't detect them anywhere in this sector. Nothing left, no wreckage, no debris, just empty space. Voss's hands clenched at his side. The sensation of something slipping away, something he couldn't control, was rising in his chest like a suffocating wave. The fleet, his fleet, had been one of the most powerful in the Wriglin armada. How could it just disappear? He knew the Wriglins. They were unstoppable, impossible. Voss muttered under his breath. Something's wrong. It's not possible. The words tasted bitter on his tongue. He had been raised to believe in the supremacy of his people, their strength, their unyielding resistance. But here, in this dark space where his ships had once been, the foundation of his certainty was starting to crumble. Where did they go? Voss demanded. The officer's fingers danced nervously across the controls, eyes flicking back and forth between the data streams. I don't know, sir. The sensors can't find anything. Not even an energy signature. They're just gone. A cold silence spread through the room, and the tension in the air felt suffocating. Voss could feel the room closing in, his thoughts racing faster than his words. He tried to steady himself, focusing on the plan, on the mission. He'd never been this out of control before. He had always been able to fix things. There was always an answer. But this was different. Send a full investigation to Fleet 29, Voss ordered. I want to know everything. This is a tactical flaw. Someone's trying to undermine us. His voice was firmer now, trying to push back the creeping doubt. The officer hesitated, eyes darting to the blinking coordinates on the screen. Commander, Fleet 29 is no longer responding either. We lost contact. The words hit him like a blow to the gut. The Verdak Prime had been leading the charge, holding the line at the front, the Wriglin Empire's territory. But now even Voss's most trusted fleet was slipping away, lost to something he could not see, something beyond his understanding. The Wriglins, the mighty empire, now faced a crisis they had never anticipated. Activate the defensive grid, Voss barked, his voice a low growl, as if the very action could rip through the uncertainty. We need to find what's happening to them. He turned sharply to his tactical officer. How are the rest of the fleets holding up? The officer's hands hesitated over the controls. We've had reports of strange gravitational fluctuations, Commander. Some of the ships are reporting strange phenomena. Gravity wells, large shifts in local gravity, possibly pulling them off course. Voss's gaze fixed on the officer. What are you trying to say? It could be a form of gravitational warfare, the officer said, his voice trembling. Something powerful enough to distort the very gravity in this sector. It's not just damage to the ships. It's as if they're being drawn into something. Voss stood stock still, his mind reeling. Gravitational warfare. A weapon of this magnitude could unravel the very foundation of their fleet's strength. This wasn't some simple tactical failure. Someone out there was targeting them with something they had never encountered before. It was a new kind of war, and it was something the Wriglins were not prepared for. Where are the next fleets located? Voss demanded, his jaw tightening. The officer quickly shifted through the data, his hands shaking. They're on the outskirts of the sector, Commander, far from the center of the Empire's power. But the disturbance, it's spreading. We've already lost contact with 4 more fleets. Voss's eyes narrowed. The fear creeping up his spine was something he hadn't felt in years. Something the Wriglins had never needed to fear. His fleet was vanishing, but he was no closer to understanding why or how. Send a message to General Tarek Ilvor, on the Imperial fleet. I want all available reinforcements in this sector immediately, Voss commanded, fighting to keep his voice steady. And activate all emergency protocols. I want to know the source of these gravity shifts. But deep down, Voss knew it was futile. The damage had already been done. His fleets were being swept away, one by one, into a vast emptiness he couldn't even see, let alone fight against. Back on Earth, Marnik wrote, sat before a row of heads-up displays, his focus unwavering, as the first of the gravity mines continued to destabilize the Wriglin fleets. He could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet satisfaction of watching the plan unfold perfectly. It had been years in the making, and now the execution was underway. One by one the fleets were vanishing, consumed by the invisible force of the gravitational disturbance. Report, Marnik said, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on the stream of data. First set of mines successfully deployed. The technician replied, a faint sense of unease in her voice. Fleet 35, gone. Fleet 17. We're beginning to see more significant shifts in Wriglin military formations. Some fleets are already being destabilized. Marnik's expression remained cold, calculating. He knew it was working. The quantum gravitic disruptors were a weapon unlike any the Wriglins could have imagined. Subtle, silent, and devastating. No missile, no bomb, no fleet could stop the gravity mines once they were deployed. And now, the Wriglins were beginning to realize that they were being eradicated. Not through brute force, but through a strategy they could not even comprehend. Continue with the next wave, Marnik ordered, his eyes flicking briefly to the timeline of the operation. We've already initiated the destabilization process. This must be completed quickly. On the verdict prime, Voss continued to pace, his frustration mounting with every minute. He'd never been so blind to an enemy before. The truth was now becoming clear. The Wriglins were not in control here, not anymore. Commander, we've got more disturbances on the outer rim of the sector, the officer said, his voice strained. Voss spun on his heel, fists clenched. This is no anomaly. We've been set up. Someone has been planning this for years, and we are just now realizing it. He leaned over the tactical console, staring at the growing black holes on the screen, representing the fleets lost to the unknown force. Every second that passed felt like a moment of power slipping from his grasp. His mind was racing. What was the Wriglin Empire's answer to this? What could they possibly do to stop it? The answer came to him too late. There was no defense. The empire that had ruled the stars with iron fists was being erased piece by piece, and they had no idea how to stop it. Voss turned to his officer, voice hoarse with disbelief. Prepare the final push. Send a fleet to Sector X9. We'll see if there's anything left to salvage. All fleets are reporting in, except Fleet 55, sir, the officer said, voice tight with a mix of disbelief and frustration. Drake Voss stood motionless, staring at the heads-up display in front of him. His gaze never left the dark, swirling anomaly on the screen. A black hole. Nothingness. The fleet had simply ceased to exist, and for the first time, Voss felt the weight of something he couldn't control. What do you mean, except Fleet 55? Voss demanded, his voice steely despite the growing panic inside him. Explain. The officer's hands trembled as they hovered over the console. Fleet 55. They've vanished, Commander. No wreckage, no debris, just gone. Voss clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms straining against the pressure. He turned toward the tactical officer, who was still scanning the data. And Fleet, same thing, sir, came the response, quieter this time. No sign of them either. The realization hit Voss like a shockwave. His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow bursts. It wasn't just one fleet. It was happening everywhere. Wriglin fleets. His fleets were simply being erased, consumed by the invisible force sweeping through their sector. His mind raced, trying to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. The Wriglin Empire had never known defeat, never known this kind of vulnerability. Yet here he was, helpless as his ships disappeared, one by one, without a trace. Shut down the emergency protocol. Voss ordered, forcing the command from his throat. Lock down every system. Get me to the war room, now. In the war room, Drake Voss stood before a laser plasma display, his eyes scanning the empty space around him. No warships, no enemy fleets, just the cold, endless void that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of imagination. The data he had received was nothing short of a nightmare. He glanced at his officers, the cold sweat on their brows matching his own. His breath caught. They were losing. They were losing to something they could neither see nor comprehend. How is this possible? Voss muttered under his breath, staring at the empty grid. The black holes continued to devour his forces. No countermeasure, no explanation, only the growing emptiness in the wake of their destruction. His fingers ran over the edge of the console. The gravity mines deployed by the UEC had already begun to take their toll. But how could one enemy, one group, wipe out his entire fleet without even firing a shot? No explosions, no missiles, just nothing. Sir, the officer at the console broke his trance. We've received a message from Imperial Command. They're advising us to retreat. Voss shot the officer a venomous look. Retreat? To where? They're everywhere. Sir, we may need to consider a different approach. Another officer piped up, cautiously. We don't know what's happening, but we can't keep pushing forward. The entire fleet is disintegrating. Voss's pride burned. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. He straightened his posture, his eyes hard. We continue. We are Wriglin. We do not retreat. Prepare to launch Fleet 6. Increase patrols. Scan every sector for the source of this anomaly. We will not be wiped out by something we can't see. Meanwhile, far from the chaos of the Wriglin Empire, Marnik Rout stood in the quiet hum of his command center. His fingers hovered over a heads-up display that illuminated his face with cold blue light. He watched the progress of his plan unfold. Each new fleet, lost to the invisible force, only adding weight to the satisfaction growing in his chest. Earth was no longer a scattered, weakened collection of colonies. Earth had become a quiet, lethal force, pushing back against centuries of oppression. Fleet 42, Fleet 55. Gone, an officer reported as the data poured in. Another success, Commander. Marnik nodded once, but his face remained neutral. Prepare for the next set. We need to complete the destabilization before the Wriglins realize what's happening. He paused, his mind drifting to the cost of this war. His thoughts briefly wandered to Ven Laro, the scout whose sacrifice had sparked this revolution. Laro's final transmission, the cryptic message that warned of the Wriglins' fragility, had set everything into motion. Yet, Marnik felt no glee in the destruction, only the quiet certainty that this was the path they had to take. Still, the cost of erasing an empire was not without moral weight. Back on the Virdak Prime, Voss finally allowed himself to collapse into the commander's seat. His mind reeled, but his hands were steady. His ships were disappearing into the void, consumed by black holes that seemed to multiply with every passing second. He gripped the sides of the chair, his breath shallow and quick. "Sir, we have another fleet gone," the officer called out. "We're down to only 3 active fleets. The rest disappeared." Voss stared at the display, his heart pounding in his chest. The ships, the fleets, all gone. The black holes continued to swirl on the screen, each one a symbol of humanity's relentless grip, tightening and pulling. He felt like a child who had tried to play a game only to realize the rules had changed. And now the world itself was changing. His pride, his unshakable belief in the Wriglin Empire's supremacy was shattered, and with it, his will to fight. But there was still one thing he could do. He could fight until the last. On Earth, Marnik stood before his own heads-up display, his fingers moving quickly. The battle was nearly won, but a sense of unease settled in. He could see the progress, the Wriglin fleets vanishing, one after the other, but the destruction felt impersonal. His mind kept returning to the faces of those lost, even if they were on the other side. He turned sharply to the officer beside him. "Prepare a message to the council. Let them know we're ready for the final phase." Voss, still at the helm of his flagship, continued to watch helplessly as his empire crumbled before him. Fleet 63, his last hope, had already been mobilized, but the realization weighed heavily on him. His people, his empire had failed. There would be no recovery, no defense. He exhaled sharply, his resolve faltering for the first time. He turned to his officer, eyes wild. "What is happening to us?" The officer, looking back at him, could only shake his head. I don't know, Commander." Voss's gaze softened, his grip tightening on the console. "I should have seen this coming." The last fleet disappeared from the screen, swallowed by the force they couldn't escape, and with it, the Wriglin Empire's last hope vanished into the void, a casualty of Earth's invisible war. "Commander, we've lost Fleet 63, the officer's voice came through, shaking with the same disbelief that had marked every report for the past few hours. Drake Voss felt his stomach tighten. The flickering image of the Virdak Prime's battle map revealed nothing but empty space, a void where once there had been a powerful fleet, now gone. No wreckage. No sign of struggle. "Damn it," Voss muttered under his breath, his fist pounding against the console. "Activate full defense protocols. Contact Imperial Command. We need to know what's happening." The officer hesitated. "Sir, we've tried to establish contact, but we can't reach any of the other fleets. All channels are down. The transmission from Fleet 63 was just gone." Gone. The word echoed through his mind, a constant reminder of how helpless he was. He had always prided himself on control, on never allowing the chaos of war to overwhelm him. But now the very foundation of that control was crumbling before his eyes. He turned sharply toward the tactical officer. "What's happening to our ships?" His voice was tight, strained. The officer hesitated again, typing furiously on the console, the beeping intensifying. It's as if they're being erased, Commander. Just disappearing into nothingness." Voss's eyes narrowed. His pride, His certainty was being replaced by something far more dangerous. The reality of their situation was setting in. "We're not facing a battle," Voss murmured. "This isn't a fight. It's a purge." On Earth, Marnik wrote, stood in front of the massive heads-up display, his eyes fixed on the data streaming in. The Wriglin Empire was falling, but something about the way it was happening, the complete and utter annihilation, gave him pause. There was no grand battle, no clash of ships, just the cold, calculated precision of their plan unfolding. Every Wriglin fleet, every flagship, erased from existence as though they had never been.
"Are we ready?"
Marnik's voice was quiet, measured. The last phase of the temporal erasure was about to begin. "Affirmative, Commander," came the reply. "The final wave of gravity mines has been deployed. The temporal erasure system is now online. We can initiate it at your command." Marnik nodded slowly. This was it, the endgame. But something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. Even though the Wriglins had never considered Earth a true threat, now they were witnessing the full force of humanity's revenge. And yet, the cost was undeniable. Erasing an empire was not without consequences, not for the Wriglins, and not for him. Back aboard the Verdak Prime, Voss stared out at the view screen, watching as another fleet, Fleet 74, simply vanished. No explosions, no gunfire, nothing. The ships were there one moment, and then they were gone. It was as though space itself had consumed them. The realization hit him harder than any battle had ever done. His fleets were being destroyed by something he couldn't even see. This was no military campaign. It was something far more insidious. A force so complete, so absolute, that the Wriglin military might never recover. "Sir, all attempts to reach Fleet 75 have failed." The officer spoke again, her voice almost too quiet to hear. Voss's eyes flickered back to the console, the familiar images of the Wriglin Empire's once proud fleet, now dissolving into nothingness. "How is this happening?" His voice cracked for the first time. He hated the feeling, the loss of control. But there was no answer, no response, just the dark, empty spaces that had once been filled with his empire's power. He slammed his fist into the armrest of his chair. "We're being erased, piece by piece," he muttered, half to himself. As the temporal erasure system activated, a quiet hum filled the room at Earth's command center. Marnik wrote, stood motionless, his fingers hovering over the controls. The final phase of the plan was unfolding before his eyes. It wasn't just a battle anymore. It was the rewriting of history itself. "Commander," the technician's voice broke through Marnik's thoughts. "It's working. The temporal erasure system is operational. We're beginning to rewrite the records. The Wriglins will no longer exist. Their fleets, their cities, their entire empire, they'll be erased from every history, from every database." Marnik's eyes flickered to the screen, where the last traces of the Wriglin fleet were being wiped away, one by one. "Good," he said, his voice cool. "Let them disappear, but make sure the cost is clear. We're not just winning a war. We're rewriting everything they stood for, their entire legacy. Make sure it's absolute." Back on the Verdak Prime, Voss watched, helpless, as the Verdak Prime was slowly drawn into the growing black hole. It wasn't just the physical destruction of his fleet. It was the erasure of everything they had built, everything they had fought for. He looked around at the crew on the bridge, their faces pale with fear and confusion. "Do you understand?" he whispered. "This is it. The end." He stood, his mind reeling. There was no escape. There were no reinforcements. The Verdak Prime was going to vanish, along with the last of the Wriglin fleets. A lifetime of pride, strength, and military might was being erased in an instant. The black hole was closing in on them, the ship's hull groaning as the gravitational pull intensified. Voss could hear the creaking of the structure, feel the pressure in his chest as the ship was pulled closer to the event horizon. On Earth, Marnik Raut stood silently, watching the final Wriglin ship, the Verdak Prime, sink into the black hole, consumed by the force humanity had set into motion. It was over. The Wriglin Empire, once the mightiest force in the galaxy, was now nothing more than a memory, a footnote in history. His fingers hovered over the console, a part of him waiting for something, some final sign of the Empire's collapse. But there was nothing, no grand victory parade, no applause, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their strategy had succeeded. The Empire that had once laughed at humanity was no more, And as Marnik watched the Verdak Prime disappear into the void, he felt the weight of the cost settle over him. The price of rewriting history, of erasing an entire civilization, was not something to be celebrated. "Is it done?" an officer asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," Marnik replied softly. "It's done."
Is it over?
The question hung in the air, carried more by the weight of its inevitability than any real expectation for an answer. Marnik Rote stood before the heads-up display, his fingers hovering over the controls. The final phase of the mission had been completed. The Wriglin Empire was erased, not in a blaze of fire and smoke but in the cold, methodical unraveling of its existence. The last fleet, the Verdak Prime, had been swallowed by the black hole, and with it the final remnants of the once proud Wriglin fleet. Marnik had done it. He had delivered humanity's vengeance. He had rewritten history itself, reducing an empire to dust gone, never to be remembered. "Yes," came the reply from his second-in-command, Karnik Strahl, though the tone was subdued, almost as if the reality of their success had yet to settle. "It's over, Commander." But Marnik didn't feel victorious. He couldn't. He stood motionless, his eyes locked on the display where the last traces of the Wriglin fleet dissolved into nothingness. There was no celebration, no victory chant. There was only an empty, gnawing void, where once a great empire had stood. The temporal erasure had worked too well. The Wriglins no longer existed in the records of time, their ships, their cities, their very history gone, as though they had never been. The display flickered, one final confirmation of their erasure. A cold satisfaction washed over Marnik, but it was quickly tainted by something else, something darker. "Shall we proceed with the aftermath, sir?" Karnik's voice broke the stillness, but it sounded distant, at a whisper across a vast ocean. The words didn't feel real. Nothing did. Marnik had planned for this moment, but the reality of it felt hollow. "Proceed," Marnik replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "Send the final reports to the Council. Let them know what we've accomplished." He could feel Karnik's gaze even though he was still facing the screens. Marnik had been their leader, their strategist, the architect of this destruction. Yet now, in the aftermath, the victory felt like a ghost, slipping between his fingers. Back on the Verdak Prime, Drakvoss had not seen the end coming. His pride, his belief in the invulnerability of his empire, had kept him going through the darkest moment. Now, as his ship spiraled toward the singularity, he understood the cost of his arrogance. There was no redemption, no last-minute escape. He had no words left, only the cold realization that his empire had been defeated, not through military strength, but through an intellectual and technological superiority that had never occurred to him. His hands gripped the edge of his console. "We've failed," he whispered, as though speaking the words could somehow undo the damage, but he knew it was too late. There was nothing left to fight. The darkness of the singularity grew, pulling him, pulling everything, into oblivion. The Verdak Prime ceased to exist as the last traces of the Wriglin Empire were sucked into the void, a symbol of their fragility. For the first time, Drakvoss understood that they were not invincible. On Earth, the temporal erasure system powered down with a soft hum, signaling the completion of the final phase. The Wriglin Empire was no more. There was no longer any trace of their existence. It wasn't a battle that ended their reign. It was something far more final, more devastating, the complete removal of their legacy. Marnik Rote had not just defeated them in battle, he had erased them from time itself. He turned to Saren Keth, his intelligence officer, who stood nearby watching the process unfold. "Is it done?" Marnik's voice had a finality to it, as though the weight of his question had settled into his bones. Saren nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the screens. "It's done. The Wriglin Empire is no more." Marnik stood motionless, his mind still processing the enormity of what had just occurred. The Wriglin Empire was now a footnote in history, a forgotten shadow that would never again cast its dark influence over the galaxy. It was a success, yes, but the cost of that success weighed heavily on him. "We've erased them," Marnik said quietly. "But what does that make us? What does it make me?" In the quiet aftermath, Karnik Strahl stepped forward. "We've won, Commander. The Wriglins won't hurt us anymore. The galaxy is ours now. You've secured humanity's future." Marnik glanced at Karnik's, but the words felt empty. It was true. They had secured humanity's future, but had they? What was left in the wake of such total destruction? Had they become the very thing they had fought against? The temporal erasure technology had ensured that no one would ever remember the Wriglin Empire. Their fleet was gone. Their people were gone. Their history had been rewritten. Yet Marnik couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process. Back at Earth's command center, Marnik Rote took a step back from the controls, his gaze drifting across the now blank screen. The empire that had once loomed over them was no more, but at what cost? Do you feel it, Karnix? Marnik asked, his voice quiet, almost inaudible. Karnix looked at him puzzled. Feel what, sir? The weight of what we've done, Marnik replied, his hand drifting toward his forehead. The cost of rewriting history, of erasing an entire empire from time. Karnix nodded slowly. We did what we had to do. They would have destroyed us if we had given them the chance. Yes, but it wasn't just their military might that we destroyed, Marnik said, his voice. It was everything. Everything they stood for. Their entire legacy gone. He turned back to the heads-up display, watching the final traces of the Wriglin Empire fade from view. A small part of him felt vindicated. Another part of him felt hollow. Marnik Rote stood before the heads-up display, watching the final remnants of Wriglin influence fade into the void. The temporal erasure had completed its task. The Wriglin Empire was no more. Their fleets, their cities, their very history gone, erased from time itself. Marnik's fingers lingered on the controls, but the satisfaction he had anticipated was nowhere to be found. Instead, a hollow silence filled the command center. Commander, Saren Keth said, his voice breaking the stillness. The records are what the Wriglin Empire will no longer be a part of history. Earth's dominance is secure. Marnik's gaze drifted from the display to the floor, his mind heavy with the weight of the moment. Secure, yes, he replied quietly. The UEC had achieved the impossible, but it felt far more like an empty victory than the triumphant moment he had envisioned. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Saren's with a contemplative look. Have we truly won? He asked, the question more to himself than to his office. Saren hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The Wriglins are erased. Their fleets no longer exist. The galaxy is ours for the taking. The words were fact, but they didn't sit right with Marnik. But at what cost? The tension in the room thickened, and Marnik could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He had orchestrated the fall of the Wriglin Empire, one of the greatest military powers in the galaxy. The gravity mines had wiped them from existence. The temporal erasure had sealed their fate, erasing them from every record. But now that the victory was complete, he wondered if it was a victory at all. The destruction felt too complete, too absolute. Marnik walked to the edge of the command center, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked out through the large viewing window, gazing at the stars as though they held the answers to questions he hadn't been able to ask. Was this really about justice, or was it just about vengeance? Sir? Saren asked, stepping closer, his tone uncertain. Marnik turned toward him, his face grim. We've erased them. The Wriglins will never hurt us again. But they will never be remembered either. Their history is gone. Every record, every scrap of their legacy wiped from existence. He shook his head, his thoughts tangled. We've become the very thing we swore we'd never be, haven't we? Back on the Verdict Prime, Drakvoss had long since died, but his pride lingered. It lingered in the empty space where the Verdict Prime once existed, swallowed whole by the black hole that had consumed the ship and its crew. A final testament to the Wriglin Empire's arrogance. No final battle, no valiant last stand, just emptiness. Marnik Rote could not ignore the ghost of that pride. The Wriglin Empire, in its last moments, had refused to see its own fragility, and now, humanity had erased them, as if they had never been. Do we deserve this? Marnik whispered to himself, a question that hung in the air. Have we lost something in the process? He returned to the heads-up display, his fingers hovering over the final report. The data that streamed across the screen confirmed what he already knew. The Wriglin Empire was gone. Their fleets had been consumed, their cities obliterated, their empire rewritten into oblivion. A new era had dawned, one where Earth stood as the dominant power. But was that truly a cause for celebration? He thought of Venlaro, the scout who had sparked this whole plan. His death had been the catalyst for this destruction. Laro's final transmission, desperate and cryptic, had shown the fragility of the Wriglin Empire. He had exposed the truth. Before his own life was snuffed out, Laro's sacrifice had delivered humanity the weapon it needed to reshape the galaxy. And now, Marnik could feel the weight of that sacrifice bearing down on him. It was a victory. Yes, but one that tasted bitter on his tongue. Hours passed in the quiet of the command center. The data came in, and the reality of their victory sank deeper into Marnik's mind. He watched the last traces of the Wriglin fleet vanish into oblivion, consumed by black holes and rewritten from the record. It felt like the world had turned, but he was no longer sure which direction it was headed. "Do you ever think about the cost, Saren?" Marnik asked, his voice low. Saren stood still for a moment, considering the question. "I think about it every day, Commander," he said slowly. "We've won. We've changed the course of history, but I think about what we've lost. How many lives? How many people?" "Exactly," Marnik interrupted, his gaze fixed on the now empty space where the Wriglin fleets had once been. "We've erased them from the fabric of time. That's not just a victory, that's the erasure of everything they were, everything they stood for. We've rewritten history, and in doing so, we've become the victors, but we've also become the erasers, the people who rewrite the story." The temporal erasure system had completed its work. There was no going back. The Wriglin Empire was gone, and with it, any possibility of them ever rising again. The UEC had secured its place at the top of the galaxy, but the victory, while final, felt incomplete. Marnik sat back in his chair staring at the laser plasma displays, the once dominant Wriglin fleets now reduced to static. What had been gained? What had been lost? "Commander," Saren spoke again, his voice more tentative now. "What now? What happens now?" Marnik's gaze lingered on the final image, the last record of the Wriglin Empire, which now existed only as a shadow in history. "We move forward," he said, his voice distant, "but we can never forget what we've done. The Wriglin Empire is no more." Marnik's voice echoed softly in the command center, though it felt empty, devoid of triumph. His eyes, locked onto the heads-up display, stared blankly at the final moments of the Wriglin fleet's annihilation. There were no celebrations, no cheers, just the quiet hum of the technology that had erased an empire, and with it, any chance for Marnik to feel the full weight of victory. Is it truly finished?" Saren Keth asked, his voice quieter than usual, a tinge of uncertainty coloring the word. He stood nearby, his hands pressed against his sides as he looked at Marnik, waiting for a sign, any sign that the man who had masterminded this war was satisfied with the outcome. Marnik didn't answer right away. The words felt hollow. He had won. Yes. But what had he really won? The Wriglins were gone, erased from history, their fleets no more than a memory, a shadow on the edge of the galaxy. The temporal erasure had ensured that no trace of them would remain, not in any record or archive. Humanity stood victorious, but the cost hung heavily in the air. "It's over," Marnik muttered, the weight of the words settling in his chest. "But I don't know if we're any better for it." The room was still, only the quiet flickering of the laser plasma displays cutting through the silence. Marnik felt the weight of his actions, the cold precision of it all. The Wriglins, who had thought themselves invincible, had been brought down not by force, but by intellect, by humanity's ability to see the cracks in their empire and exploit them. But in doing so, Marnik had rewritten history. Was that justice, or had humanity become something darker, more like the enemies they had once fought? "We've erased them," Marnik continued, his voice low, his thoughts tangled. "Their fleets are gone, their legacy, their records wiped clean. But what's left? What does that make us?" He turned to Saren, his eyes tired, haunted. "We've rewritten the story of the galaxy, but at what cost?" On the Verdak Prime, the last of the Wriglin fleets, Drake Voss had already met his end. His ship, once a symbol of the Wriglin Empire's power, had been sucked into a singularity, vanishing without a trace. The Verdak Prime was gone, and with it, any hope the Wriglins had of ever rising again. The Empire, so proud and untouchable, had been dismantled piece by piece. All that was left was a void. Marnik's thoughts lingered on the faces of the Wriglins, on Drake Voss, who had once stood so arrogantly, so confidently. He had been certain of his victory, certain of the superiority of his empire, and yet, he had fallen, swallowed by a force he could never comprehend. The temporal erasure had done more than simply remove the Wriglins from the galaxy. It had erased their entire history, their achievements, their very existence. What was left in their place? A galaxy now dominated by Earth. But at what price? Was it worth it? Marnik asked himself, almost inaudibly. The finality of the Wriglins' erasure was overwhelming, but the questions it left in its wake were heavier still. Had humanity become the very thing it had once opposed? Had they crossed a line that they could never uncross? Saren stepped forward, his gaze soft but steady. We had no choice. Marnik, the Wriglins would have wiped us out eventually. They had the power, the numbers, the fleets. They weren't going to stop until we were nothing. You did what needed to be done. Marnik's eyes flicked to the laser plasma display, where the final confirmation of the Wriglin fleet's destruction flashed, but his gaze was far away. Did I? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did I really do what needed to be done? Or did I just become what they were? A force of destruction that leaves nothing but empty space in its wake. The screens in front of them continued to flash, reporting the last stages of the operation. The Wriglin Empire was gone. There would be no retaliation, no more fleets to challenge Earth's dominance, no more Wriglin threats. But the weight of victory hung heavy on Marnik's shoulders. There would be no accolades, no celebrations, only the quiet realization that the galaxy would never be the same. Where do we go from here? Marnik asked, more to himself than to anyone in the room. The UEC is in control now, Saren said carefully, choosing his words. We've secured our future. Humanity is the dominant power. But Marnik couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about power. It was about something far more complex, far more dangerous. He had rewritten the galaxy's story. But what if they had written themselves into a corner? What if this power came at a price they couldn't pay? We've won, Marnik said finally, but it felt like a hollow victory. But the cost is more than I ever imagined. As the final Wriglin ships vanished from the screens, Marnik stood there in the quiet command center, staring at the empty space where their empire had once stood. There would be no memorials, no stories to tell. The Wriglin Empire would be forgotten, as if it had never existed. What had humanity truly gained in their victory? The power to erase the past, to rewrite history. It was a power that came at a great cost, a cost that Marnik knew could never be truly understood. The victory was complete, but it felt like the end of something, not the beginning. Is this what we've become? Marnik asked, his voice barely audible. Saren was silent for a moment. What do you mean? Marnik finally turned to face him, his eyes heavy with the weight of his own thought. We've erased the Wriglins, erased their empire, their entire history. We've won, but I fear what we've become in the process. The room was quiet once more, as the final echoes of the Wriglin Empire faded into the distance, their influence extinguished. The UEC stood as the undisputed power in the galaxy, but even as the galaxy turned, Marnik Rot knew that this victory would never be fully his. It was a victory built on the ashes of an empire, and the cost of that victory would echo in humanity's future forever.